Hey everyone, it's Habiba. Welcome back to my channel. Thanks for joining me today. So in today's video, we're going to be talking a little bit about global affairs. And of course, I have something very exciting for you at the end. So stay right to the very end. So to kick us off is the conflict in Sudan. As you may or may not know, for the past 3 weeks, since the 15th of April, there's been a conflict raging between two generals, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hamedti, and Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, both of whom are embroiled in a bitter struggle for power. Things have deteriorated quite rapidly, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing their homes to neighboring countries, Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Chad. There have been several ceasefire attempts, and both generals agreed to these ceasefires. However, none of the ceasefires have been honored to date. The conflict has exacerbated pre-existing issues in the country, particularly in the Darfur region that has been at the center of systematic attacks from the Janjaweed militias for decades. So the Darfur region has already been home to thousands of internally displaced persons, and the current conflict has only served to worsen the situation, with many people fleeing into neighboring Chad. Some sources have estimated that at least 700 people have been killed in the fighting so far and thousands more wounded. Of course, these are conservative estimates, so the real number is likely much higher. And UNICEF estimates that at least 190 children have been killed since the fighting began. And imagine this is only in the past 3 weeks, so things have been happening so rapidly, so many lives have been lost so rapidly. Sources estimate that 100,000 people have already fled the country. And again, remember that these are conservative estimates. So I just want to read to you an article from Anadolu Agency. It's a Turkish news agency. So this article reads, the UN Refugee Agency has set an initial planning figure for more than 800,000 refugees and returnees that might flee conflict-torn Sudan for neighboring countries. Furthermore, more than 200,000 refugees from neighboring South Sudan and elsewhere now in Sudan may be forced to return home prematurely. So bear in mind that for many years, for decades, Sudan has been home to refugees from other countries. The article mentions South Sudan, but also from Eritrea, from Ethiopia. You know, there are many Eritrean refugees who have been living in Sudan for a long time. So the conflict is affecting Sudanese people, but also refugees from other countries who sought asylum in Sudan a long time ago. So the effects of this conflict are very far-reaching, and it has turned into a full-scale humanitarian crisis. I mentioned all the people fleeing into neighboring countries, but of course there are so many people, millions of people in the country who will not be able to flee for a variety of reasons, whether it's due to lack of money to leave the country, to board buses, cars, to leave the country, as well as other reasons. So many people will be forced to stay in the country and battle the air raids and bombings from the military and the paramilitary. They're running out of food, running out of water, running out of basic necessities, running out of medicine. Hospitals have been bombed, schools. So think of the patients in the hospitals, such as those who are receiving dialysis treatment, women giving birth in the hospitals, just the very vulnerable situation that they're in. So it's turned into a full-scale, full-blown humanitarian crisis, as I've mentioned. So Sudanese communities around the world are asking that people interested in supporting make a donation to SAPA, or the Sudanese American Physicians Association. SAPA has launched an emergency medical relief on their website, which is sapa-usa.org. I will link it here. I'll share everything. So if you're interested, you can go ahead and contribute to the humanitarian relief effort for the Sudanese people through their website. So we want to send light, prayers, and very importantly, monetary contributions to the people of Sudan to assist them and to help them overcome their humanitarian crisis by the grace of God, and also through our own actions. There has been a lot of activism on the part of Sudanese diaspora communities around the world, such as right here in Canada. The community recently boarded a bus from Toronto to Ottawa to protest the war, to ask Justin Trudeau and the Canadian Parliament for more action on the issue, to break the silence, to speak out, and to help those in crisis and Canadian citizens in Sudan return home. We know evacuation efforts, unfortunately, for many countries have been slow, and many of them remain incomplete, such as the Canadian evacuation effort. There are still many Canadian nationals trapped in Sudan, unable to return home. As a final closing thought, I really hope that everyone, everywhere can rally around to help bring an end to the conflict, to support the humanitarian efforts, to pressure our governments to scale up the evacuation efforts. And finally, I just like to make a global call for peace and to peace in Africa. You know, when I reflect on this, one thing that comes to mind is that we really need a strong and a unified Africa. We've seen so many conflicts in the continent in the past. I think of the Liberian and the Sierra Leonean Civil War. The Liberian Civil War, there were upwards of 300,000 deaths. We think of the Rwanda genocide, the Darfur conflict, early 2000s. You think of the Somali Civil War. There are so many examples to draw from in the continent, and unfortunately it continues due to so many issues. Not going to get into that. The power struggle I mentioned earlier between the two generals being one of them. And for those of us who are African or African heritage, African background, we know already so many of the struggles that exist in the diaspora for African peoples, right? So therefore, it's very important to work towards and to ensure at all costs that we can have a unified continent, a strong homeland, as one way to give ourselves options and to mitigate some of the very dire realities of migration, of settling in the diaspora, some of the realities that we see like in the second generation, you know, the generation born here in the diaspora, issues of displacement, of inclusion, of belonging, of racism, so many things, access to housing, access to employment, all of which are known too well by immigrants in countries such as Canada, America, European countries. We don't want our home continent to become empty. We want an Africa that's flourishing, that's thriving, that's free of tribalism, that's free of enmity, animosity towards one another. We want to learn about each other, learn about our great and vibrant continent, and do everything within our means to try and ensure its success. And this, I'm speaking globally, you know, this is my reflection coming out. This is my reflection on the Sudanese conflict, but this applies globally to so many African nations. So to the people of Sudan, we send our love, light, heartfelt prayers, and of course, donations, monetary contributions to the humanitarian relief effort. I'll link the information in the description box below. So on to the next news item, which is population growth, climate change, and global consumption. So I found an interesting article recently from the David Suzuki Foundation. It's called, "Should We Be Worried About 8 Billion People?" Because, you know, for a little while now, media and governments have created so much panic around global population growth. And they've called on certain countries, particularly countries in the global south, where you have black and brown people, to limit their birth rate and so forth. However, I'm going to read you a little bit from this article because it helps put things into perspective and offers an alternative way to think about this. So here we go. The article reads, "The average person in the US and Canada emits more than twice as much as someone in the European Union or the UK, and 10 times as much as in India and Pakistan. But Pakistan, like many countries that have contributed least to the problem, has been hit hard by climate impacts, with 1/3 of the country devastated by floods in 2022. Consider also that much of the global north's wealth is in effect stolen from the global south. Through ongoing colonial enterprises, wealthy people and nations have exploited the natural resources and people of lands everywhere, from slavery to driving indigenous peoples from their own territories and destroying lands and waters for mining, fossil fuel development, industrial agriculture, and massive dams and power plants." And it ends, "Our immediate crisis is caused by a system that encourages endless growth, exploitation, waste, and energy use. Population growth is a factor, but it's one that can be addressed partly by rethinking our greed-based economic system and the inequalities it creates. So what the article is saying is that instead of obsessing over the number of children women are having, women in Africa in particular, put a focus on reducing consumption, particularly here in the global north, where there's excessive materialism, where people love to shop till they drop, essentially, and where industries such as the fashion industries and so many other industries create so much waste at the expense of countries in the global south that are forced to deal with the devastating realities of so much industrial pollution, of excessive consumption, which we know leads to climate change, which leads to desertification, which we're seeing now in the Sahel region of Africa and in the Sahara Desert. We see people, nomadic communities, the Fulani, the Tuaregs, and so many others being pushed out of their traditional homelands. They end up in internal displacement camps. They end up as refugees around the world. And one of the main culprits behind this is climate change, is overconsumption. Therefore, it was wholly inappropriate when Emmanuel Macron, I believe it was in 2017 or 2018, he said, Africa's problem is the fact that its women have 7 or 8 children, and he referenced the country of Niger, I believe, and that's actually incorrect for Niger, FYI, it's not 7 or 8 children, but anyway, that's beyond the point. It was wholly inappropriate for him to say that. Not to mention, you have certain countries, China, India, Japan, Russia, that are actually trying, Canada, that are actually trying to incentivize women. I don't know if Canada is trying to incentivize women, but anyway, that's another topic. But countries that are trying to encourage women and incentivize them in some places to have children because they're struggling with an issue of population decline. So what does that mean in the next few decades? So again, we see how leaders try to scapegoat the average person to put the burden of climate change on us. I'm not saying individuals should not attempt to reduce their carbon footprint. I totally believe in that. Reduce, reuse, recycle. That's what they told us growing up here in Canada in school. That try to reduce your carbon footprint and so forth. But governments, they do try to scapegoat the average person instead of tackling root issues such as war, mining, large-scale agricultural projects. So think of, the heavy use of chemical fertilizers, what that means for the environment, car manufacturing, all these industries. The war industry, war is one of the top contributors to climate change. So I think it's time we stop obsessing about population growth and the number of children certain women are having, particularly Black women, African women. Let's stop obsessing over the number of children they're having. Let women be free to choose the number of children they want to have and focus rather on some of those root issues that I've just mentioned. So thank you, David Suzuki Foundation, for this great piece. Oh yes, and check out my interview from a couple of years ago with Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, a renowned climate change activist from Chad who's doing great work in this issue, and she's at so many conferences around the world addressing issues of climate change and what it means for indigenous peoples around the world, what it means for her community in Chad, where she's from. And so she really breaks it down very well. So if you want to delve a little deeper into this, check out this interview, very cool interview I managed to have with her in 2018. And to end us off is the story of Mr. Yakuba Sawadogo from Burkina Faso, who's also been dubbed the man who stopped the desert. In 2020, he was awarded the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award for his efforts in stopping the advance of the desert, because as I sort of mentioned in the previous story, there's so much desertification happening as a result of climate change, as a result of so many factors, and it's affecting so many communities throughout the Sahel region of Africa, communities in this country, Burkina Faso, and many people, they're fleeing their villages, they're fleeing their home, seeking greener pastures, literally, elsewhere. In summary, in the 1980s, Mr. Sawadogo began to notice a decrease in rainfall, rising temperatures, and climate change in his village in northern Burkina Faso, and the effects this was having on his community and on farming. He's a farmer. So I'm going to read briefly from the Champions of the Earth article on him so you can understand a little bit about how he did this. Sawadogo, known locally as the man who stopped the desert, modified a traditional cultivation practice called zay, which allows crops to grow in pits that trap rainfall, even in regions beset by water shortages. His technique, now nearly 4 decades old, is used by farmers across a 6,000-kilometer stretch of Africa. He says, "Back in the 1980s, we had good land and not so great land. But over time, we have really seen a decline in the quality of our soil and the productivity of our fields. In the early 1980s, that slow decline culminated in a crippling famine, both in Burkina Faso and neighboring countries." Yakuba Sawadogo, he says, "This project is for future generations, not only for Burkina Faso, but for many other countries." So like I said, the results have been remarkable. They've made several films about him. You can watch the videos. I'll link some of the videos. Mr. Yakuba Sawadogo from Burkina Faso, the man who stopped the desert. So congratulations to him and his entire community for his efforts in trying to slow and overcome the devastating effects of climate change. And he's a true pioneer because he's been at it for over 40 years now, since the 1980s. And he is most deserving of the UN Champion of the Earth Award. Thanks everyone for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in my next video. Bye.